My father didn't just break my heart that night. He set fire to the bridge that connected us and handed me the matches. I'm Jade. I'm 29 years old. And until 3 weeks ago, I was the invisible daughter of the powerful Marcus Sterling. While my siblings were paraded around as CEOs and doctors, I was the one who allegedly failed to launch. But at my father's 60th birthday gala, a room filled with the city's elite, venture capitalists, and the very people who funded his empire, he decided to make me his final punchline. He stood there, gripping a glass of vintage scotch that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and looked directly at me in the back of the room. "And then there's Jade," he chuckled into the microphone, the sound echoing through the 5,000 a plate dinner. "Every family has a black sheep. Some have degrees, some have businesses. Jade has a collection of failed dreams and a permanent spot on my payroll. Let's raise a glass to my daughter, the world's most expensive hobby." The room erupted. It wasn't just a polite titter, it was the mocking roar of the upper class looking down at a parasite. I felt the heat rising in my neck, but I didn't look away. I didn't cry. Instead, I felt a strange, cold clarity wash over me. For 20 years, I had kept a secret to protect his ego. For 20 years, I played the role of the uneducated daughter because he couldn't handle the truth. But as I watched him soak up the applause of 200 people at my expense, I realized the game was over. I didn't need his approval. In fact, by the end of next week, he was going to be the one begging for mine. "Hold on. Before we get into the real stuff, I want to know, what are you doing at this exact moment while hearing my voice? I love seeing your answers down below in the comments." I stood up, the legs of my chair screeching against the marble floor, cutting through the laughter like a blade. I didn't scream. I didn't throw my drink. I simply caught my father's eye, the eye of the man who thought he owned me, and I whispered loud enough for the front table to hear. "Enjoy the throne while it lasts, Dad, because you just insulted the only person who can save your company from the vultures." He laughed again, louder this time. "Save me? You can't even save a receipt, Jade. Sit down before you embarrass yourself further." I didn't sit down. I walked out, and as the heavy oak doors closed behind me, I pulled out my phone. I had one contact saved under a name he would never associate with me: the architect. I swiped call. "It's me," I said, my voice steady as I stepped into the cool night air. "The merger is off. Pull the funding. Start the hostile takeover of Sterling International. I want his desk cleared by Monday." But what my father didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that Jade the failure didn't exist. She was a mask, and the woman behind the mask was about to dismantle his life brick by brick. The silence of the night air outside the gala was a jarring contrast to the roar of laughter still echoing in my ears. As I stood on the curb waiting for my car, the weight of 29 years of playing small finally fell off my shoulders. My father, Marcus Sterling, was a man who measured worth in Ivy League diplomas and quarterly earnings. To him, I was the daughter who dropped out of the prestigious business school he handpicked for me. In reality, I didn't drop out. I was recruited. While he thought I was finding myself on a gap year that never ended, I was actually the lead architect behind Vanguard Equity, a shadow firm that had quietly swallowed up 15% of his industry's market share in under 3 years. He called me uneducated because I didn't have a piece of paper from his alma mater. He had no idea I was the one teaching his competitors how to bleed him dry. My phone buzzed. It was a text from my older brother, Julian, the golden child, the CEO in waiting. "Jade, you're making a scene. Come back inside and apologize to Dad before he cuts your allowance. You know how he gets." I stared at the screen and felt a cold smirk tug at my lips. Allowance? The allowance Dad gave me was pennies compared to the dividends I moved into offshore accounts every Tuesday. I had stayed on his payroll purely as a tactical move, a front-row seat to his downfall. "Apologize?" I whispered to the empty street. Julian, you have no idea who you're talking to. I ignored the text and climbed into the back of a black sedan that didn't belong to the Sterling fleet. My driver, Marcus, a man I'd hired away from a private security firm, didn't say a word. He just handed me my tablet. On the screen was the real-time data for Sterling International. The stock was already beginning to quiver. My father's retirement party was meant to be a victory lap before he handed the keys to Julian. But there was a poison pill in the company's latest acquisition, one I had personally planted 6 months ago through a shell company. By 9 a.m. Monday, the board of directors would receive a whistleblower report detailing irregularities in the Sterling merger. Irregularities that only one person could fix. The car pulled up to my penthouse, a place my father thought was a rent-controlled studio he was subsidizing. In reality, I owned the entire building. As I stepped into the elevator, my phone rang again. This time, it wasn't Julian. It was the chairman of the board for Sterling International, Arthur Vance. Arthur was my father's oldest friend, but in business, Arthur had the loyalty of a shark. Jade? Arthur's voice was hushed, urgent. I just saw your exit. It was bold. But Marcus is livid. He's talking about removing you from the trust entirely tonight. Let him, Arthur, I said, pouring myself a glass of water as I looked out over the city skyline. In fact, encourage him to do it. It'll make the legal transition much cleaner when I take his seat. There was a long, stunned silence on the other end. His seat? Jade, what are you talking about? You're just a kid. You don't even have a degree in finance. I don't need a degree to own the bank, Arthur, I replied, my voice dropping an octave. Check your secure inbox. I just sent you the proof of funds for the hostile takeover. I now control 32% of Sterling's voting shares through Vanguard, and by Monday morning, I'm coming for the rest. I hung up before he could breathe. The first domino had fallen. But the real revenge? That wasn't just about money. It was about watching the look on my father's face when he realized the worthless daughter he mocked was the only thing standing between him and a prison cell. The weekend was a calculated silence. While my father was likely nursing a hangover and bragging to his golf buddies about how he put Jade in her place, I was sitting in a darkened war room with 3 of the sharpest legal minds in the country. The trap is set, Jade, my lead counsel Sarah said as she slid a blue folder across the mahogany table. Your father signed the acquisition papers for the Green Tech merger yesterday afternoon. He was so distracted by the gala that he didn't even notice the clause on page 84. I leaned back, a slow smile spreading across my face. That clause was a masterpiece of corporate sabotage. It stated that if the merger failed to meet specific environmental benchmarks within 48 hours of signing, the primary creditor, Vanguard Equity, had the right to call in the entire debt immediately. And guess who controlled the environmental reporting agency? Me. He thinks he's untouchable, I murmured, glancing at my watch. It was 11 p.m. on Sunday, the calm before the storm. He thinks because I didn't finish his perfect business school, I don't understand how leverage works. He's about to learn that leverage isn't taught in a classroom. It's built in the shadows. My phone lit up. It was a call from my mother, the woman who had spent years looking at me with a mixture of pity and disappointment, always sliding me secret $100 bills like I was a charity case. Jade, honey, she whispered, her voice trembling. Your father is in a rage, Arthur Vance called him. Something about a hostile takeover? He thinks you're involved. Please, tell me you haven't done something stupid. Just come over, apologize, and we can fix this. I'm not coming over, Mom, I said, my voice cold and clinical. And there's nothing to fix. Tell Dad to keep his tie straight tomorrow morning. He's going to need to look good for the cameras. Jade, you're talking about your father's legacy. Everything he built. Everything he built was on the backs of people he stepped on, I interrupted, including me. He called me worthless in front of everyone he respects. Tomorrow I show him what worth actually looks like. I hung up and turned back to my team. "Is the press release ready?" "Ready for the 8:30 a.m. opening bell," Sarah confirmed. The headline, "Sterling International Faces Liquidity Crisis as Vanguard Equity Moves for Control." I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window of my office, looking down at the Sterling Tower 3 blocks away. The lights were on in the executive suite. He was working late, probably trying to figure out why his CFO wasn't answering the phone. He didn't know his CFO was already on my payroll. The tension in my chest wasn't fear. It was adrenaline. For years, I had played the uneducated daughter, the one who stayed home and read silly books while my siblings discussed market caps. He never realized those books were ledger entries and law texts. The cliffhanger wasn't whether I would win. It was how much of his pride I would leave intact. As the sun began to peek over the skyline on Monday morning, I put on a power suit that cost more than my father's first car. I didn't look like the girl at the gala anymore. I looked like the woman who was about to buy his life. My phone chimed with a final notification. Sterling International stock, 14% in pre-market trading. The bloodbath had begun. The elevator doors of the Sterling building slid open at exactly 8:55 a.m. The lobby was a hive of panicked activity. Traders were glued to their phones, and the receptionist, a woman who had ignored me for a decade, was frantically trying to direct a swarm of reporters away from the executive elevators. I didn't stop. I walked straight toward the private gold-rimmed lift. "Excuse me, Miss Sterling," the receptionist called out, her voice cracking. "Your father is in a high-level emergency meeting. He's not seeing family today." I didn't even break my stride. I scanned my thumb on the private biometric pad, a pad my father thought only he and Julian could access. The light flashed green. "I'm not here as family," I said over my shoulder. "I'm here as the landlord." The ride up to the 50th floor felt like a countdown. When the doors opened, the sound of shouting hit me like a physical wave. My father was at the end of the hall, screaming into a handset, while my brother Julian paced the floor, white as a sheet. "Where's the liquidity?" my father roared. "Vance told me the credit line was frozen. Who the hell is Vanguard Equity?" I stepped into the boardroom. The entire board of directors was there, slumped in their leather chairs, looking like they'd just survived a shipwreck. My father looked up, his face turning a deep, dangerous shade of purple. "Jade, what are you doing here? I told you on Saturday. You are persona non grata in this building. Get out before I have security drag you out." "Actually, Dad," I said, sliding into the empty chair at the head of the table, the one reserved for the chairman. "Security works for the person who pays the building's lease, and as of 6 minutes ago, that's me." The room went deathly silent. Julian stopped pacing. My father dropped the phone. It dangled by its cord, emitting a faint rhythmic beeping. "Don't be ridiculous," Julian stammered, trying to find his voice. "You don't even have a bank account we don't monitor. You're the dropout. The failure." I pulled a single, notarized document from my briefcase and slid it across the glass table toward Arthur Vance. "Arthur, would you mind reading the beneficial ownership disclosure for Vanguard Equity? I believe the board would like to know who their new majority shareholder is." Arthur's hands shook as he put on his glasses. He looked at the document, then at me, then back at the paper. His jaw literally dropped. It's Jade. She owns 51% of the voting stock through the shell acquisition of the green tech debt. My father moved faster than I'd seen him move in years. He snatched the paper, his eyes darting across the lines. "This is a lie. This is some prank. You don't have this kind of money. Where did you get the capital? Who is backing you?" I stood up, leaning over the table until I was inches from his face. The man who had called me worthless in front of 200 people now looked small, pathetic. "I didn't need a backer, Dad," I whispered. "I started a small software firm when I was 19. The one you told me was a waste of time." I sold it to a Silicon Valley giant for $80 million 3 years ago. I've been using that hobby money to buy up your debt every time you overextended yourself to keep up appearances." His eyes bulged. "$80 million? You lived in that studio. You took the checks I gave you." "I needed you to keep looking down on me," I said, a cold smile playing on my lips. "Because as long as you thought I was a failure, you never looked at me as a threat. You were so busy mocking my lack of education that you didn't notice I was the one writing your bills." I turned to the board. "Gentlemen, the first order of business is the immediate removal of Marcus Sterling as CEO for gross negligence and the concealment of company debt." My father slumped into a chair, the air leaving his lungs in a ragged wheeze. But I wasn't done. The financial ruin was just the beginning. The real, uneducated mistake he made was much, much deeper. "And Julian?" I looked at my brother. "Pack your bags. You're fired too." The silence in the boardroom was so heavy you could hear the air conditioning humming in the walls. My brother Julian looked like he'd been struck by lightning. He looked at the high-back leather chair he'd spent his entire life grooming himself for, then back at me. "You can't fire me, Jade," Julian stammered, his voice cracking. "I'm the CEO. I have a contract. There are protocols. You're playing a character. This is some kind of sick joke because Dad embarrassed you at the party." I didn't blink. I pulled a second folder from my briefcase. This one was red. "Julian, you've spent so much time looking down at me that you forgot to look at your own balance sheets," I said, sliding a document toward him. "Your contract has a morality and performance clause. Specifically, Section 8.4, the use of company funds for private offshore accounts. Would you like me to show the board the $6 million you diverted to your Cayman account last spring to cover your gambling debts?" Julian's face went from pale to ghostly white. He sank into his chair, his mouth hanging open. The board members, who moments ago were looking at me with skepticism, now turned their predatory gazes toward Julian. In this room, weakness was a death sentence. My father finally found his voice, though it was raspy and stripped of its usual booming authority. You've been spying on us? For how long, Jade? How long have you been planning to destroy your own family?" "Destroy?" I laughed, and the sound was sharp, cinematic. "Dad, I didn't destroy this family. You did that the moment you decided that my value was tied to a title you gave me. I didn't spy. I audited. I'm a shareholder protecting my investment, and right now, the Sterling name is a liability." I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city. "You called me uneducated, but while you were teaching Julian how to drink expensive scotch and look important, I was learning how to read the fine print. I learned that your empire was built on a foundation of sand and ego." I turned back to the room. The power shift was palpable. The board members were already leaning toward me, sensing where the true strength now lay. "Gentlemen," I addressed the board, "I am calling for an immediate vote. We can either let Sterling International go into a controlled bankruptcy under my leadership, or we can let the SEC walk through those doors in 20 minutes to discuss Julian's creative accounting. What's it going to be?" Arthur Vance was the first to raise his hand. "I vote for the transition to Vanguard Equity control." One by one, the hands went up. My father watched, his eyes wide, as his loyal friends abandoned him like rats on a sinking ship. He looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw something in his eyes that I'd never seen before. It wasn't love. It wasn't even regret. It was fear. "You're a monster," he whispered. "No, Dad," I replied, picking up my briefcase. "I'm your daughter. You taught me everything I know about being ruthless. You just didn't realize I was a faster learner than you." But as I prepared to walk out of that boardroom as the new owner of the Sterling legacy, I realized there was one more secret my father was hiding. Something that wasn't in the financial ledgers. something that explained why he hated me so much. And I was about to find it in his private safe. The board members cleared out like ghosts, leaving only the wreckage of a family behind. Julian was slumped over the table, staring at his reflection in the polished mahogany, while my father sat frozen, his empire crumbling in real time. "The office needs to be vacated by 5, I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence. "I've already had the IT department revoke your server access. Don't bother trying to delete the green tech files. I have the originals." My father finally looked up. The fire was gone, replaced by a hollow, haunting stare. "You think you've won, Jade? You think owning a building and a few spreadsheets makes you a sterling? You've always been an outsider. Even your mother knew it." I paused at the door. "What is that supposed to mean?" He gave a dry, rattling laugh. "You were always so obsessed with proving your worth to me. You worked 10 times harder than Julian just to get a nod of approval. Do you want to know why I never gave it to you? Why I mocked you in front of those people?" He stood up, leaning heavily on the table. "It wasn't because you were uneducated, Jade. It was because every time I looked at you, I saw the mistake that nearly cost me everything 30 years ago." My blood ran cold. This wasn't about business anymore. The atmosphere in the room shifted from corporate warfare to something much darker, much more personal. "I'm going to my office," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Security will escort you out." "Go ahead," he sneered. "Check the floor safe behind the portrait of your grandfather. The code is your birthday, the only day I ever truly regretted." I walked out of the boardroom, my heels clicking like a metronome against the marble. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I entered the chairman's office, my office now, and locked the door. The portrait of my grandfather hung on the far wall, a stern man with the same cold eyes as my father. I swung it aside, revealing a sleek digital safe. My birthday, at 09/14/95. The safe hissed open. Inside wasn't a stack of cash or a ledger of bribes. It was a single yellowed envelope and a small leather-bound diary. I opened the envelope first. It was a DNA test from 29 years ago. My breath caught in my throat as I read the results. Probability of paternity, 0%. I wasn't a sterling, not by blood. The room seemed to tilt. All those years of striving, of building an empire in secret just to show him I was worthy of the name. And the name was never mine to begin with. But as I flipped through the diary, my mother's diary, the truth became even more twisted. My father had known since the day I was born. He didn't cast me out. He kept me close. He kept me under his thumb, mocking me and belittling me, not because I was a failure, but because I was a living reminder of a debt he owed to the man who actually fathered me. And that man? He wasn't some random mistake. According to the notes in the margin, my biological father was the very man Marcus Sterling had cheated out of his first company 30 years ago to build this very empire. The uneducated daughter wasn't just a rival. I was the rightful heir to the foundation of his entire life. My phone buzzed. It was a notification from the lobby. "Ms. Sterling, there's a man here claiming to be a process server for a Mr. Silas Vane. He says it's urgent." Silas Vane. The man my father had ruined. The man whose name was written in my mother's diary in bold, desperate ink. The revenge was no longer just about a gala insult. It was about a 30-year-old blood feud that was about to go nuclear. I sat in the oversized leather chair, the DNA test fluttering from my hand like a dead leaf. The irony was a physical weight in my chest. My father, or the man I called father, had spent 3 decades treating me like a stray dog he was forced to feed, all while building his fortune on the ruins of my real father's life. The intercom buzzed again, sharper this time. "Ms. Sterling? The man from Silas Vane is insisting. He says he knows you've opened the safe." "Send him up," I whispered into the receiver. The door opened moments later, but it wasn't a process server in a cheap suit. It was a man in his 60s, silver-haired, wearing a tailored coat that screamed old-world wealth. He looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw my own eyes reflecting back at me from someone else's face. "You have the sterling look of determination," the man said, his voice a deep, resonant rumble. "But you have your mother's soul. I've waited 29 years to walk into this office, Jade." "Silas Vane," I said, my voice finally finding its edge. "The man my father stepped on to build all of this. He didn't just step on me, Jade. He stole the patents that started Sterling International. He blackmailed your mother into staying with him to keep me silent. He told her if she ever reached out to me, he'd ensure I spent the rest of my life in a cage." Silas stepped closer, his gaze softening. "He called you worthless because he was terrified that one day the blood in your veins would wake up and realize it was born to lead, not to follow." I looked down at the documents on my desk, the hostile takeover, the debt acquisitions, the firing of Julian. I had done it all to prove I was a Sterling. I had fought a war to win a crown that belonged to a tyrant. "He's downstairs," I said, a new kind of fire igniting in my gut. "He's waiting for security to escort him out of his building." "Then let's go greet him," Silas replied, but not as his daughter, as the woman who finally reclaimed what was stolen before she was even born. We walked out of the office together. As we reached the executive lobby, Marcus was there, arguing with 2 security guards. He looked disheveled, his tie crooked, the mask of the great Marcus Sterling completely shattered. When he saw me walking side by side with Silas Vane, the color drained from his face so fast I thought he might faint. He clutched the edge of the mahogany reception desk, his knuckles white. "You," Marcus gasped, pointing a trembling finger at Silas. "I told you to stay away. I had an agreement." "Agreements based on lies expire, Marcus," Silas said calmly. I stepped forward, crossing my arms. "You mocked me at the gala, Dad. You told 200 people I was a freeloader with no future. You wanted the world to see me as a failure so no one would ever look close enough to see the truth." I took the DNA test out of my pocket and held it up for the entire lobby to see. The assistants, the guards, the remaining board members. "But here's the thing about uneducated people, Marcus. We're very good at doing our own research. So," I turned to the head of security. "Change the locks on the private elevator. And if Marcus Sterling or Julian Sterling ever set foot on this property again, have them arrested for trespassing." Marcus let out a guttural sound, a mix of a sob and a growl. "You can't do this. I raised you. I gave you everything." "You gave me a front row seat to your cruelty," I countered. "And today, the show is over." But as the guards began to lead him away, Marcus stopped. He looked back at me with a twisted, hideous grin. "You think you've won? Check the Green Tech liquidation account, Jade. You might own the company, but I've spent the last hour ensuring you've inherited a mountain of fire." My heart skipped a beat. I sprinted back to my desk. If he had triggered a self-destruct sequence in the company's finances, my victory would last less than an hour. My fingers flew across the keyboard, the glow of the monitor reflecting in my eyes as I accessed the encrypted Green Tech liquidation subledger. My father's final words felt like a cold hand tightening around my throat. I had spent years meticulously planning this takeover, but I had underestimated one thing: the desperation of a man with nothing left to lose. "Jade, what is it?" Silas asked, leaning over my shoulder. "He's activated a burn clause," I whispered, my voice trembling with focus. "It's a legacy protocol buried in the server's BIOS from 10 years ago. If his master biometric key is removed from the system under duress, it triggers an automated sell-off of all liquid assets at 50% market value to a blind trust in Panama." The screen flickered. A red progress bar was crawling across the interface. Liquidation, 12% complete, 15% complete. In less than 10 minutes, Sterling International would be a hollow shell. I would own a building, a name, and billions of dollars in unpayable debt. The worthless daughter would be the captain of a sunken ship. "Can you stop it?" Silas gripped the back of my chair. "Not from here," I said, my mind racing through lines of code I hadn't looked at in years. "He's locked the external override. The only way to kill the sequence is from the basement, the physical mainframe room. But that room is on a separate power grid with a mechanical lock." I grabbed my tablet and bolted for the door. I didn't wait for the elevator. I hit the emergency stairs, my lungs burning as I descended floor after floor. This was the moment. This was the uneducated girl's real final exam. As I reached the sub-basement, the air grew thick and hummed with the heat of 1,000 servers. I reached the heavy steel door of the mainframe room. Locked. I looked at the keypad. It wasn't digital. It was an old-school, 6-digit mechanical combination. I closed my eyes. My father always thought I was staring into space when he gave his long, rambling lectures about family history and sterling traditions. But I was listening. I remembered a dinner from 5 years ago when he bragged about his first successful deal, the date he conquered his first rival, March 12th, 1984. I dialed in, 031284, click. The door swung heavy on its hinges. I sprinted to the central terminal. The red bar was at 82%. Come on, I hissed, plugging my tablet into the emergency port. I wasn't just Jade Sterling anymore. I was the architect who had built an empire in the dark. I bypassed the user interface and went straight into the kernel. 85%, 88%. My hands were blurring. I wasn't just stopping the sell-off, I was rerouting the destination. If Marcus wanted to send the money to a blind trust, I would let him. But I was changing the trust's signature. 95%. 98%. The screen flashed. Process terminated. I slumped against the server rack, the cold metal cooling my skin. I had stopped the bleed at 99%. Only a fraction of the capital had escaped. But then I looked closer at the final destination of that last 1%. My eyes widened. The blind trust in Panama wasn't owned by my father, and it wasn't owned by me. It was registered to my mother. A new realization hit me like a physical blow. My mother wasn't just a victim in this story. She had been playing her own game for 30 years. My phone rang. It was an unknown number. I answered it, my voice barely a whisper. "Hello?" "Jade." My mother's voice came through, sounding calmer and more powerful than I had ever heard her. "I see the transfer hit the account. Thank you, honey. Now, would you like to know where I've been hiding the rest of the sterling evidence for the last 3 decades? The cliffhanger wasn't my father's downfall. It was the fact that the woman I thought was weak was actually the puppet master. The hum of the server room felt like it was vibrating inside my skull. I stared at the blinking cursor on my tablet, the confirmation of the transfer to my mother's account glowing like a neon sign. "Mom?" I stammered, my voice echoing off the cold metal racks. "What do you mean, evidence? You've been watching this entire time? You let him treat me like garbage for 29 years while you had the power to stop him?" "I didn't just have the power to stop him, Jade," she replied, her voice steady and devoid of the nervous tremor I had grown up with. "I had the power to destroy him. But if I had used it too soon, he would have vanished with the money, and you would have grown up in the shadow of a great man who was simply misunderstood. I needed you to become the woman you are today. I needed you to build your own armor." I felt a surge of hot anger. By letting him call me worthless? By letting him humiliate me in front of hundreds of people? "He thought he was humiliating you," she said softly. "But he was actually testifying to his own blindness. Every time he mocked your lack of education, he was telling the world he didn't know his own daughter. And while he was looking at you, he wasn't looking at me. I've spent 30 years as the quiet wife, copying his hard drives and documenting every bribe, every payoff, and every offshore shell company he ever touched." I leaned my head against the cool server rack. The betrayal was layering like an onion. My father was a fraud, my biological father was his victim, and my mother was a silent assassin waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "Where are you, Mom?" "I'm at the house," she said. "The family estate. Your father is on his way here now. He thinks he's coming home to pack a bag and hide. He doesn't know that the front gates are already locked, and the police are waiting at the end of the driveway." "And Julian?" I asked. "Julian is a Sterling," she said with a hint of pity. "He'll do what Sterlings do when the ship sinks. He'll try to trade secrets for a shorter sentence, but he doesn't have the secrets I have. Jade, get to the house. There's one last thing you need to see. Something your father kept in a safety deposit box that he's bringing home today." I didn't wait. I scrambled out of the basement, past the stunned security guards, and back to the lobby where Silas was waiting. "We have to go," I told him, grabbing his arm. "To the Sterling estate. Now." The drive was a blur of high-speed turns and sirens in the distance. As we pulled up to the massive iron gates of the Sterling mansion, the house where I was always made to feel like a guest, the scene was chaotic. Blue and red lights reflected off the manicured hedges. My father was being led out in handcuffs. He looked aged, his face sallow and defeated. When he saw my car pull up, he stopped. He didn't scream this time. He just looked at me with a hollow, haunted expression. "You took it all," he whispered as the officers nudged him toward the squad car. "You and your mother. You were both vipers in my bed." "No, Marcus," I said, stepping out of the car. "We were just the people you underestimated." I walked past him, through the front doors, to where my mother was sitting in the grand foyer. On the coffee table sat a small, velvet-lined box. "This is it," she said, gesturing to the box. "The reason he kept you. The reason he couldn't let you go, even though he hated what you represented." I opened the box. Inside wasn't money or jewelry. It was a single old-fashioned key and a deed to a property in Switzerland. "What is this?" I asked. "It's not just a property, Jade," Silas said, stepping up behind me. "It's the original patent office for the technology Marcus stole. And that key, it opens a vault containing the one thing that can wipe the Sterling name off every product in the world and replace it with yours." But as I reached for the key, a shadow moved in the doorway. It was Julian. He wasn't in handcuffs. He was holding a folder, and he had a look of desperate, wild triumph in his eyes. "Not so fast," Julian sneered. "You think you've won? You forgot about the succession clause Dad made me sign in private. If he goes to jail, I don't just lose the company, I inherit the legal right to sue the majority shareholder for hostile interference. I might not be the CEO, Jade, but I can tie you up in court until you're 80 years old." The tension snapped back like a rubber band. The victory was slipping through my fingers at the finish line. Unless... I looked at the deed in the box. Julian stood there, a smug, desperate grin plastered across his face. He held that folder like a shield, believing that a piece of paper signed in a dark corner could save him from the tsunami I had unleashed. "The succession clause, Jade," Julian gloated, taking a step toward the coffee table. "Dad knew if he ever fell, I'd be the one to claw it back. I'm the legal successor. You're just a temporary glitch in the system. I'll drain your accounts just to pay the lawyers to keep you in a deposition for the next decade." I looked at the folder. Then I looked at the deed in the velvet box. Finally, I looked at Silas. "Julian," I said, my voice dropping to a calm, terrifying whisper. "You really should have spent more time in the legal department and less time at the craps table. Do you know what a void ab initio is?" Julian's grin faltered. "A what?" "It means void from the beginning," I said, picking up the Swiss deed. "This deed proves that the technology Marcus used to build Sterling International was never his. It was stolen. In the eyes of the law, Sterling International was built on a criminal act. You can't inherit a succession right to a company that legally shouldn't exist." I stepped closer to him, the power radiating off me. "Every contract Marcus signed, Every clause he gave you, and every share he issued is legally fruit from a poisonous tree. When I file this deed with the SEC tomorrow morning, Sterling International won't just be under my control, it will be dissolved, and a new entity, Vane Sterling Global, will rise from the ashes. Your succession clause is worth about as much as the paper it's printed on. Julian looked at the folder in his hand, as if it had suddenly turned into a snake. He looked at our mother, who simply sipped her tea, and then at Silas, the father he never knew he had been robbing. "It's over, Julian," I said. "You can walk out of here now and keep whatever's in your personal bank account, or you can stay and wait for the federal marshals to ask you about those Cayman transfers I found. Your choice." Julian didn't say another word. He dropped the folder, turned on his heel, and walked out the front door, disappearing into the night. The house was finally quiet. The monster was in a cell. The golden child was gone, and the truth was finally out in the open. Silas walked over and placed a hand on my shoulder. "What now, Jade? You have the company, you have the name, you have everything you ever fought for." I looked at the velvet box. For years, I thought I wanted my father's respect. I thought I wanted his chair and his empire, but standing here I realized I didn't want to be a Sterling at all. "I'm not going to be him, Silas," I said, a sense of peace finally washing over me. "I'm not going to build a life on secrets and stepping on people. I'm going to use this hobby money to fix every life he ruined, starting with yours." I turned toward the camera, toward you, the viewer. They told me I was uneducated. They told me I was worthless because I didn't fit into their narrow little boxes. But here's the secret. When people underestimate you, they hand you a superpower. They let you build your kingdom in the dark while they're too busy staring at the sun. I smiled, a real, genuine smile for the first time in years. My name is Jade Vane, and this is just part 1 of my story. If you enjoyed this journey of justice and high-stakes revenge, make sure to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to share this video with someone who needs to know their worth. And subscribe to Silent Revenge Lab for more stories where the underdog finally bites back. See you in the next one.